Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Oh, Amen.
And I had mentioned yesterday about the section of Parshat Re'eh that is quite difficult in the sense of it's very, very, very rigorously anti-idolatry. And the punishments and the consequences are just really, really significant. And here we are going to be reading eventually about a city. Uh, and fortunately, within the Rashi, we'll see how the rabbis try to minimize the extent in which, how broadly the punishments can be administered and to try to limit the amount of actual people who would necessarily be punished for what they're doing. Having said that, I was reflecting more because yesterday we were talking about it as well, about the whole concept of idolatry and the rejection of God and things like that, and why it's possibly couched in this kind of language that is so severe. And I think that, not so much the issue of, being somehow enabling one to mete out these punishments. It's rather trying to make us realize how significant that is when you reject the idea of one ultimate and transcendent creator of the universe. Um, One thought that's been going through my mind quite significantly lately, I know I'm not unique by any means regarding this thought, is the degree to which kindness could change everything. That if people, instead of the anger and the desire for revenge and things like that, if there was some way to have both kindness and justice, right? You can't have nothing but kindness, although it's interesting that Abraham, the patriarch Abraham, represents that kindness, which would be the foundation. But immediately after that, you have Isaac, who represents justice. So the idea of need, but the fact that there's such a lack of kindness in this world, and people who are so empowered and don't consider that, um, and how important that is in terms of trying to make sure that this world becomes a better place. And directly in that response, because I was talking about belief in one universal, transcendent sovereign, is the idea that we are all God's children. That if we take that concept seriously and see ourselves all as being one great family, that comes straight out of seriously believing in one creator of all humanity and, in fact, the world. It also goes beyond that because it also places us in a position of saying, well, we're actually caretakers. This world was made by God as well. It's not for us to pillage it and to abuse it, but to recognize that, in a sense, uh, we are here as our status is that of renters. That the property, we don't own anything, we only have the use of it. And this all comes out of trying to understand our relationship to the universe and the idea of a great creator. And of course, I could go on and on, but when you reject it, what happens as a result? And the Torah trying to underscore just how destructive it can be in rejecting this kind of notion and stating it in the way we're going to read. So with that, I'm going to continue here with the text. Ki tishma ba'achat arecha. If you hear of one of your cities, that in one of your cities, Asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha. Look at this. The idea of it being that God, the Lord your God, has given you Lashevet Sham, to dwell there, Lamor, saying. So in other words, if you hear saying, but this parenthetical phrase, in a way, uh, parallels what I was saying in my introduction to this particular section, right? We're only there because God has given us these things in which to dwell. And of course, we realize our lives are temporary. So it's all part of it, part of a deeper understanding of our relationship to the reality around us. Lashevet sham, to dwell there. Interesting. Krat Yerushalayim. With this exception, this by saying Lashevet sham excludes Jerusalem. Shelo nitna ledira, because Jerusalem wasn't given in order to dwell there. In other words, of course, the idea of Jerusalem, I believe, there's probably a lot more to this that we might be getting out of Torah Tmima, but we're going to have to wait on that. And the idea that Jerusalem, of course, is the site of the temple, and the fact that it is the site of the temple puts it in an exceptional situation. But it doesn't say here the reason why Jerusalem would be excluded from the law that's going to follow is because there's a temple. But it says because we're not really allowed lashevet sham, to dwell there in the same sense that we would have in other cities. So again, look at this, a beginning of a limitation, right? The law applies, but not to Jerusalem. Ki tishma v'gomer lemor. So Rashi is helping us with the syntax of the sentence here. Omrim kain, in other words, people are saying yatsu v'gomer. So what's going to follow in the next verse? Here's yatsu, right? So this is what you've heard. Yatsu anashim b'nei blial. There are people who of wickedness, and the interesting word blial, yal is help or something like that, or assist, not so much assistance, but I would say of worth, of help, of that. So bli means without, right? They have no purpose, I would say, in a way, but we understand it as meaning people who have empty lives and just don't do anything to contribute to the world. Mikirbecha, from among you, from among you. Let's keep going. V'yadichu et yoshvei iram lemor, and they lead astray the people who are dwelling in their city by saying, these wicked people are saying, Nelcha v'na'avda, let us go and let us serve Elohim acherim, other gods, asher lo yedatem, of which you have no knowledge. Let's take a look. Right, so here we are. Anashim, velo nashim. So if it's women who are doing this, law doesn't apply. Law doesn't apply. It only applies if men are doing this. And that's understanding this word anashim. And again, another limitation. So if it's true that there are probably more women populating the world than men, okay, so we're taking at least 50% or more of the population and saying this law is not going to apply to them. Neblial. And it's an unusual kind of phrase. So, and this is also in Sanhedrin, the tractate Sanhedrin. Li all. So he's putting in a blav, and it's saying without a yoke. Shepaku ulo shamakom. They have cast off the yoke of God. In other words, ultimate ain't no one going to tell me what to do attitude. They're not willing to take what God would demand of us and do it. They have cast that off. They see it as a burden. Yoshvei Iram. So again, another limitation. Below Yoshvei Ir Acheret, and they are not people who live in another city. In other words, practically speaking, what it's saying is if there are people in Tel Aviv who go to Haifa and convince the people of Haifa to worship idols, what is going to happen is not applicable. It has to be from the city itself. Mikan Amru, and from this they derived, Ein ne'eset ir hanidachat, it is not considered destroyed, a city to be destroyed, ad sheyadachuhu anashim, until men lead it astray, but ad shehiyu, and not until medicheha mitocha, right? The people who are setting this city astray have to be from the city itself. They have to come from the city itself. So we can see how the rabbis are also struggling with the, at least on the surface, what appears to be something very cruel, and they're trying to find a legal way in which to limit the application of this law. So, going on. V'darashta, you shall investigate, v'chakarta, and you shall inquire, v'sha'alta hetev, and you will thoroughly investigate. V'hine, and behold, emet nachon. So I'm saying that phrase emet nachon means it's an established fact. This matter, hadavar, this matter is an established fact. Ne'esta hato'eva hazot b'kirbecha. This disgusting thing was done in your midst. In other words, here we're talking about the general Jewish population, the general Israelite population. So this is a basis of the idea that in order to have justice, you have to thoroughly investigate. If justice is not based on facts and truth, it's not going to be justice. So, v'darashta v'chakarta v'sha'alta hetev. So, you shall investigate, you shall inquire, and you shall interrogate very well. And again, in Tractate Sanhedrin, which discusses in general the application of law. Mikan lamdu, from this verse they learn sheva chakirot, right? They learn 7 different kinds of inquiry. Miribui hamikra, okay, from the fact that Scripture basically uses a redundancy in the text, that all these redundancies are understood to mean additional ways. So, for example, they talk about Rishot and Chakirot when you study Sanhedrin, and it's the kind of questions with which you examine the witnesses. So it isn't just about the events, it might well be about the time of day. The questions can be, in other words, was it in the morning? Was it rainy? I think there's even an example given of, what color were the leaves on the tree at the time? And it may be a little different from that, but I'm giving you an idea of the degree of investigation that would go in to establish the fact that this is the truth. Okay? Kan yesh tosha, there are 3. So there are 3 types of inquiry here. Drisha, that is the investigation, v'chakira, and what we translated as inquiry, v'hetev, and the word hetev, well, thorough. And he says, and the term v'sha'alta, right, this word here, eino min haminyan, is not considered to be a 4th thing. It's not part of the counting. Umimenu lamdu, right, and from this they learned. Bedikot, right? They learned the idea of bedikot, meaning the investigation, and it actually is a technical term of the type of inquiry that's being done here to check the facts, right? Umakom acher, and in a different place, Umer, it states, and this is in chapter 19 of Deuteronomy, V'dirshu hashoftim hetev, right? So there they have drisha, the idea of drisha, and here we're talking about bedika, right? Hetev. V'od b'makom acher, and in another place it says, V'darashta hetev. It goes ahead and says V'darashta hetev. So you can see that these this particular expression is said many times. V'lamdu heitev heitev, and they learned heitev, the fact that it uses heitev in one place and heitev in another place, right? The gzera shava. Gzera shava means that you can use it to have an analogy from one situation to another, and to understand that in even though this is mentioned in different places, that they come together in terms of our understanding. Litain ha'amur shel zeh bazer. So he's saying for us to understand that what is referenced in one context is also referenced in that from another context in the same context. Meaning, if A applies to situation X, and there's a similar word to situation Y, you can take what you learn in situation X and apply it to situation Y. So that's how they get all these ways in which something needs to be investigated. Again, this is all obviously moving towards not having to apply the punishment. But here comes the punishment. Hakeh takeh. You shall absolutely, look at the intensive form here. You shall utterly smite et yoshvei ha'ir hahi, the inhabitants of that city. The ficharev, at the edge of the sword. Hacharem ota, you shall. So cherem means something that it can mean, it's a term used for excommunication, right? And in other words, to just place it out of society. In this particular case, the word cherem can mean several different things, but here clearly it's meaning that no one is going to own this property at all, and cherem can refer to that kind of property, right? So in this context, I translated as destroy it, ve'et kol asher ba, and everything that it contains, ve'et behemta, and its cattle, lefi charev, all at the edge of the sword. And make sure I'm not leaving anything out here. Here it is. Hakeh takeh. And this is in Baba Metzia, the tractate Baba Metzia, page 31. Im incha yachol lahamitam b'mita haktuva bahem. The repetition of the word hakeh means even if you're not allowed to apply the specific capital punishment that applies to them, hamitam ba'acheret, you can use a different way. So if you can't put them to death, let's say in the context of what we're reading here, if you can't put them to death at the edge of a sword, you can shoot them. Basically, it's saying, no matter what, you have to destroy it. And again, right, so we're left with this horrible sense of how awful this really is. And again, my sense is, if we're looking at this from a literary perspective, which, as you know, is the basis of the way in which I try to understand the Torah, right? We're being told that this is something that's basically anathema, which means that we have to fight against it, that it's really something that we have to take seriously and see what we can do to understand the deeper purpose of our lives and the fact of what our life is really about. But it's a very personal thing. At least that's the way I try to understand it, that it's speaking to me personally and how I need to try to avoid this kind of behavior that would have this kind of consequence. Going on, we're not finished. The et kol shlala, and all its booty, right? All its spoil. Tikbots, you shall gather. El toch rechova, into the middle of its wide area. It means like its marketplace, right? V'sarafta ba'esh, and you shall burn in fire et ha'ir, the city, ve'et kol shlala kalil, and all its spoil, all its beauty, completely. Lashem Elohecha, to the Lord your God. V'haitai tel olam, it shall be a perpetual mound. Lo tibane od, it shall not ever be rebuilt. So what do I mean to burn this to the Lord your God? So he says, Rashi tries to help us here, lishmo ubishvilo, that when it says to the Lord your God, the fact that you're doing this for God's sake, that the reason you're doing this is in terms of your loyalty, to demonstrate your loyalty. Velo yidbak beyadcha, and they should not be in your hand. They shouldn't be sticking literally to your hand. Ma'uma, anything, right? Anything at all. Min hacherem, from these banned objects. Here's this word cherem again. In other words, you shouldn't in any way personally benefit from what had to happen here. Lema'an yashuv Hashem mecharon apo, in order that the Lord should return from his anger, v'natan lecha rachamim, and should be able to act mercifully towards you, v'richamcha v'hirbecha, and show you mercy and multiply you, make you great. Kasher nishba labotecha, just as he swore to your forefathers or your ancestors. Very, very tough. Leman yashuv Hashem mecharonapo, in order that the Lord your God may return or may go back from his intense fury. Shekol man, this is from the Sifrei, Shekol man she'avodat kochavim ba'olam, because as long as there's idolatry in the world, charon af ba'olam, there's also this intense anger in the world. Very, very challenging things for us to be able to internalize. And we discussed yesterday the difference between idolatry and fetishism. Why? Ki tishma b'kol Hashem Elohecha, for you will be listening to the voice of the Lord your God, lishmor et kol mitzvotav, to guard all his commandments, asher anochi mitzavcha hayom, which I command you today, la'asot hayashar, to do that which is right, righteous, beinei Hashem Elokecha, that in the eyes, literally, of the Lord your God. So, again, the fact that the Torah is saying we've really got to do the best we can. We really have to try very hard. And also, of course, we can derive the fact that idolatry, practicing idolatry, is in a sense a way of rejecting all the mitzvot, that it is equal and tantamount to all the other mitzvot, idolatry. And I will stop right here where we are. And we'll continue the next lesson with a new chapter, which hopefully will give us a little bit of a pause for this material. So I'm going to stop the share. Okay, very hard stuff. Do you want to share anything for the record? I realize there's a lot that could be said and a lot to think about, I believe. And of course, this kind of stuff can turn people off. I know that, so we can see, I think it was important to show how the rabbis tried to limit very much an actual idea of applying this kind of law. You can imagine. It's pretty awesome. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.